Thank you for joining us today for the DNC book series on organizing and mobilizing for the 21st century electorate. We're really excited to have with us Nancy Cantalupo, who is a law professor at Wayne State Law School. She will be discussing Good and Mad, the revolutionary power of women's anger. And so really excited to have her here. And so she joined Wayne State after teaching as a full-time faculty adjunct or fellow at California Western School of Law, Barry University School of Law, where she was my colleague, Georgetown University Law Center, George Washington University Law School, and Temple University Beasley School of Law. She has also practiced with the firm of Drinker Biddle Reith LLP and served as an assistant dean for clinical programs at Georgetown Law, as well as an associate vice president for equity, inclusion, and violence prevention at Higher Education Professional Association, and as a research fellow with the Victim Rights Law Center. Professor Cantalupo is a nationally recognized scholar and expert on Title IX, sexual harassment, and gender-based violence in education. Her scholarship draws from her 25 years of anti-campus sexual harassment and gender-based violence work as a researcher, campus administrator, victims advocate, attorney, and policymaker, and focuses on the use of law to combat discriminatory violence, particularly gender-based violence. She has also been invited to write several book chapters as well as op-eds for the Washington Post, New York Times, USA Today, and Time Magazine. In her pro bono work, Professor Cantalupo has consulted with President Obama's White House Task Force to protect students from sexual assault, participated on a U.S. Senate roundtable, served as a negotiator on the negotiated rulemaking committee that amended regulations for the Clery Act, and testified before the Maryland and Virginia state legislatures. She has also chaired the board of the DC Law Students in Court and served on the advisory boards of the Serve Justice and the Clery Center for Security and Campus, as well as the board of directors for the Asian Pacific Islander Domestic Violence Resource Project and the Conference for Asia Pacific American Law Faculty. More recently, she co-authored Title IX and the Preponderance of Evidence, a white paper, which was signed by over 115 law professors from across the country and was asked by the American Bar Association's Commission on Domestic and Sexual Violence to write recommendations for improving campus student conduct processes for gender-based violence. So thank you, Nancy, for joining us. We're really excited to have you here.
Okay, thanks so much, Nadia. I am going to share my screen if I can find it, because I have a PowerPoint just so that some of the quotes that I pulled out of the book do not get lost. So let me get it going. Okay, all right, so again, thank you. This is really fun. As you know, Nadia, as you know, I am such a big fan of Good and Mad, and really a fan of Rebecca Traister's her work generally, including this book. Nadia, I'm getting a notification of someone who's entered the waiting room. Should I just admit anybody where that pops up?
Yes, please.
Okay.
And then also, if anybody is making too much sound or something, because we've had some Zoom bombers also, so you may have to remove them also.
Okay. Okay, so I want to start my comments on the book with a brief anecdote. So this book came into my life at a moment when I particularly needed it. It was in the months of 2018 and early 2019 when Betsy DeVos was seeking to use the powers of the US Department of Education to gut protections for sexual harassment and abuse victims, as well as other populations such as transgender students, that they previously had under Title IX, which is the groundbreaking 1972 anti-gender discrimination civil rights statute. And during that time, I was involved in organizing members of the public to write and file comments with the department in protest of these proposals. That effort was actually quite successful. Over 124,000 comments were filed and they're largely in protest. What we know is that they're largely in protest of, the vast majority, in fact, are in protest of the proposals. Nevertheless, for me personally, those months were quite exhausting and sometimes very lonely because I did this work, mainly sitting at my computer with only very task-focused email-based interactions with fellow activists, which is a far cry from being surrounded by the energy of a march or rally. And obviously I was also very angry and struggling to remain productively angry rather than just angry and depressed. And Good and Mad, along with a book that was drafted, collectively written and compiled by the organizers of the 2017 Women's March, called Together We Rise. Those two books enabled me to surround myself with women who were as angry as I was and whose energetic fighting against the oppressive forces that had led to that anger reminded me that I was not alone and that we collectively had the kind of power that could not and would not be ignored. And it helped me to just recommit myself to my activist work on a day-to-day and sometimes an hour-by-hour basis. I actually downloaded the book. I have an Audible account, so I had the book on audiobook, and so I would just listen to it and re-listen to it, even while I was driving or doing the dishes, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what I mean about sort of surrounding myself with the voices of the women in these two books. So for those of you who have yet to read the book, it's organized into 4 parts, and so I thought I would give just a little bit of information about that. So part 1, which is entitled Eruption, tells the story of American women's reactions to national political events from approximately the 2016 presidential primary campaigns through the #MeToo explosion and the early 2018 March for Our Lives, which was initiated by the high school student survivors of the school shooting in Parkland, Florida. And there are references to earlier events in part 1, including the decades of feminist deep freeze. That's a direct quote from the book. That began with the Reagan era and only began to thaw during the Obama administration. And part 1 really talks about how those decades contributed to many American women, especially white women, being unwilling to get visibly angry about injustice in the way that they had during various previous times in US history, including most recently the 1970s. And this unwillingness is contrasted from the very beginning, and indeed throughout the book, with the ways in which many contemporary women of color have continued both the work and the expression of such righteous anger, even when we are punished for it. And part 1 sketches how those decades, as well as the more recent events and women's reactions to them, contributed to 45's presidency, which then ripped the wool from the eyes of many previously complacent women, exposing the deeply unjust society, especially with regard to sexism, racism, and economic inequality in which we still live. So part 2, which is entitled Medusas, highlights various examples of women who were spurred to political activity by this righteous anger at injustice, as well as the difficulties and challenges that these and many women, most women, face in managing their expressions of such anger in their political work. So Traister devotes chapters to women elected officials and politicians, as well as political movement leaders, and sort of how they deal with their anger, including the anger that led them to seek public office and spurred them to political activism in the first place. So among many others, in this part we hear from and about Congresswoman Barbara Lee, Maxine Waters, Patricia Schroeder, and Shirley Chisholm. We get sort of vignettes about and from Senators Kamala Harris, Patty Murray, and Elizabeth Warren. And of course, we hear quite a bit about Secretary of State, Senator, First Lady, and presidential candidate Hillary Clinton. Sprinkled throughout part 2, which sort of interweaves the history of the first wave of the women's movement, a little bit of the second wave, but the focus is really on the first wave. With these current events, we learn about activists who are as diverse as Susan B. Anthony, Frederick Douglass, Audre Lorde, Jessica Morales, and Mamie Till. So part 2 also tackles the complicated issue, and just so you know, I'm putting up, photos just because I do have a couple of quotes, but rather than putting up quotes for long periods of time, I thought I'd sprinkle it in with some photos that I had. And so the photos, the women who are in, most of the photos are just protest photos, and I don't know the names of the people who are in it, but on this slide, the person who is all the way on the left-hand side of the screen is Marian Wright Edelman. And then in the middle, we have Tarana Burke at the Women's March. And then a picture on the right of Pauli Murray, the great civil rights activist and lawyer and reverend. So part 2 of Good and Mad also tackles the complicated issue of women's anger at each other. And it does so in a way that introduces readers to, I think, what are 2 particular gifts of this book. First, its accessible presentation of women's political involvement and activism in the US dating back to the nation's earliest years. And second, its honesty and balanced perspective regarding the stresses on and flaws in those movements. So Traister achieves both by connecting the current events of part 1 with women's movements as old as the Seneca Falls Convention and the coalition of the abolitionist, suffrage, labor, and even prohibitionist movements of that time. And readers also learn about the links between the current events that are the primary focus of the book, as well as the mid to late 19th century movements and the civil rights and second wave movements of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. So as much as those movements did and do act in coalition and with unified goals, Good and Mad does not shy away from addressing their problems and divisions, which are born not only of sexism, but also of the racism and massive economic inequality that plagues this country. So even as she gives fulsome attention to those divisions and the failings of the movement leaders that were unable to entirely overcome their acculturation into this deeply unequal society, Traister keeps her readers focused on who sowed and widened and ultimately benefits from these kinds of divisions. And that group is the white, male, and propertied minority that has ruled this nation from its inception. So for instance, part 2 devotes a chapter entitled How Minority Rules to numerous illustrations of this phenomenon. And a significant portion of this chapter focuses on the way in which pro-slavery racists used the Reconstruction era 15th Amendment to not only split the anti-racist abolitionist movement from the women's suffrage movement, but to break the suffragettes into rival camps. And the same chapter discusses the undue amount of attention that is regularly paid to internal conflicts within women's movements, including in relation to the 2017 Women's March, which, as we all know, it was the largest single day organized and unified protest in American and probably world history. So the chapter contrasts these depictions of women's movements with how similar divisions in movements dominated by men, divisions that Traister correctly identifies as universal to any large political movement or campaign. She contrasts the depictions of the women's movements with the movements dominated by men, where these kinds of divisions are discussed as a source of strength to the movement, as opposed to a sign of weakness, as they are with women's movements. And Traister points out how the popular image of women's movements being, since their inception, on the verge of collapse, responds to what the ruling minority, again, correctly, perceives as the true and powerful threat of women's movements. So she explains that regularly presenting women's movements squabbles as the most notable thing about them, often in advance of or in place of their unifying aims and improbable achievements, is a way to undermine those movements. And it is particularly important to the ruling minority to undermine the women's movement because it is not made up of an oppressed minority, but of a subjugated majority. And that subjugated majority, by dint of its size, can have power over the minority unless its foundations are eroded. Such erosion is relatively easy to accomplish because structurally, majorities, by the very nature of their scale, are bound to include groups with varying and warring priorities and goals. And these structural realities mean that there are powerful incentives to focus on divisions between women. Just meaning that in order to maintain power over majority movements, like women's movements, the ruling minority has to use the movement's differences to divide and weaken them. So that's part 2. Part 3 then focuses more on the second wave of the women's movement, and again interweaves that history with the current events that are the focus of the book. And the current events, the particular current events that are at issue are the focus of part 3, are the millions of disclosures about sexually abusive men that came out during even just the first few months, literally the first hours of the hashtag #MeToo explosion. So, part 3 does, with those responses to those current events and with the second wave events or history, it sort of pulls those together and does a very similar thing like part 2 does with the first wave of the women's movement. And like with parts 1 and 2, the views and statements of a wide range of American women are included in part 3. They range from US Senators like Mazie Hirono and Kirsten Gillibrand to activists such as Tarana Burke, Andrea Dworkin, and Catherine McKinnon, and include even journalists and media figures like Traister herself. So because of its focus on Me Too, sexual and the underlying problem of Me Too, which was sexual harassment and abuse, I actually teach part 3 in a law school course that I teach called Sexual Violence and the Law. And I find that that part of the book provides an excellent introduction to students who, despite being upper level law students, have rarely received any in-depth education about sexual harassment or gender-based violence, and certainly not their connections with American politics. So I've also given this book as a gift to just about every member of my family, as well as urged countless colleagues to read and teach the book in their classes. And as a result of both a gift and my urging, one colleague has taught part 4 in her Women and Gender Studies Honors Capstone course. This part, which is entitled The Furies, turns more fully to today's women politicians and activists, especially the new ones who have been drawn into political work since 2016. And we learn about activists such as Aditi Juneja, Amanda Littman, Jessica Ziegler, and Emma Gonzalez, as well as candidates for political office like Luba Gretchen Shirley, Rachel Crooks, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and Stacey Abrams. And we're left with the impression, that 50 years from now, the years that are covered by this book, as well as the years that we've been living and fighting through since the events covered by this book, that these years may be described as the beginning of a third wave of the women's movement, and that this third wave will be understood as connected to coalitions of movements similar to the first and second waves. Because if we look at a event like the Women's March, we can see that coalition in place. There were lots of people who were marching for issues that were related to gender, but there were just as many people who were marching for issues related to race, to economic inequality, to sexual orientation, to the environment. There were a whole range of issues that were represented in those massive marches. But it's this impression of that 50 years from now, this will be described as the third wave of the women's movement. It's what kept me coming back to Good and Mad while I was engaged in helping Americans to protest Betsy DeVos's attempts to gut Title IX. And it's kept me looking for signs since then that we are doing the job that Traister sets out in the final pages of the book, which is to stay angry, perhaps for a very long time. I personally have no problem staying productively angry because I have been on a slow burn for decades. But I like to have some company. So I have kept my eyes peeled for whether the movement that began emerging in 2016 has been sustained by a significant number of other people since the events that are covered in this book. And in light of what has happened during the pandemic in particular, especially the sustained Black Lives Matter protests and conversations, I'm hopeful that we are, in fact, in the midst of a contemporary coalition of movements dealing with equality, fighting for equality and against injustice, and that those will continue for some time to come. I hope that they continue for some time to come because we really need to sustain them. I agree with Traister absolutely that we need to stay angry and stay active because we're facing so many problems that were not only created by the last 4 years, but that have been building up for decades, which is also what Good and Mad does such a good job of showing. Therefore, I thought I would conclude by pulling out a fact about the 2020 election that echoes points made in Good and Mad and that underscores the need to stay productively angry, as Rebecca Traister urges. So a quote in Good and Mad from Jessica Morales, who is described as a left-wing activist who worked for the Clinton campaign. In this quote, she notes that the Clinton campaign, was well aware of the difficulties in getting non-college educated white women to vote for Clinton. She says, in every focus group for 2 years, basically, always white women, some college educated, but most not, would say things to us like, I'm not sure if my husband likes her. He's got to like her for me to vote for her. It's basically them deciding to be on our side and not be Phyllis Schlafly. And the answer is that, of course, we lost because these women have never chosen our side ever. Never, ever, ever. So the Pew Research Center's report on the 2020 election seems to confirm Morales's statement. It notes that Trump's vote share among white women without a college degree grew slightly between 2016 and 2020. And now 64% of this group supported Trump in 2020 compared to 35% who supported Biden. These percentages are almost exactly reversed for white women with a college degree, with 59% of those women supporting Biden and 40% supporting Trump. So in this sense, the 2020 election confirms the phenomenon discussed in Good and Mad, that white patriarchy persists in part by making white women dependent on white men, and then ensuring that those women enjoy the benefits in exchange for their support of those men's continued dominance. It also confirms how critical education is to women achieving the kind of independence that might lessen or eliminate that continued dominance. So obviously it's not my role, nor would I have time today to suggest that we should address this persistent, how we should address this persistent problem. But I would like to suggest that there are many possible approaches that we could take. One comes from Dr. Jill Biden's longtime policy goal of providing free community college to all Americans. And having read Merge Left, which I believe is the book talk for next week, I anticipate that Professor Ian Haney Lopez will be suggesting other promising ideas that have emerged from his research that could, reach this particular population. I also think it's worth creating the types of policies and programs that have long been promoted by women of color and social justice feminists. So social justice feminists have long and correctly pointed out that if we seek to solve the problems faced by populations subjected to the most intersecting forms of discrimination and oppression, we will end up helping those who face only one or two forms of discrimination or oppression. So for example, if our policies and programs are designed to assist impoverished women of color, they almost inevitably will also assist men of color, white women, and poor people in general. My overall point just is that I want to emphasize how many avenues exist for putting our continued anger at injustice to productive use. And that sort of leads me back to where I started, which is that if you find yourself feeling tired or lonely in your efforts along those lines, I recommend reading, rereading, and surrounding yourself with the women of Good and Mad, as well as Together We Rise. And even if you only do it for a few minutes or a few hours, that I promise you that will be a good way to recharge your battery.
Okay, thank you so much, Nancy, for your presentation, as well as for your review of this work. And so one of the things I wanted to ask you about, and for those of you who are in the audience, if you want to type in questions into the chat, or you're welcome to unmute yourselves as well and ask the question. And so there's this idea that she talks about in the book where she says, this is about the specific nexus of women's anger and American politics, and about how the particular dissatisfactions and resentments of America's women have often ignited movements for social change and progress. So how has that anger in some ways, as you talked about, been repressed, and how, as those who are working to engage, the electorate in different ways, what would be a good strategies for re-engaging around ideas of social change and progress?
Right. Well, so I can't necessarily say anything about that beyond, my own experience. I will say that, the book presents lots of different examples of how women have tried to, I think there's a chapter that's called Dress Up Your Anger. So there are various ways in which women have, especially women who are sort of leaders and in the public eye, have tried to sort of downplay their anger or disguise it as something else. And I think it's fair to say that Traister seems to come to the conclusion by the end of the book that we shouldn't do that, right? We should just own our anger, and own that it is about more than, we're not just throwing a temper tantrum, right? This is about anger at injustice and creating change and fixing persistent and long-term problems, many of which have to do with persistent inequalities in our society. And that that we should be angry at that. That is a reasonable and correct response to that kind of injustice and inequality, and that we should, and therefore we should own it, right? And we shouldn't spend so much energy trying to make it seem like it's something else. And that in some ways, what we're seeing, or what we've been seeing since 2016, is more willingness on the part of women generally to do that, you know, to express their anger, to do it straightforwardly, and to own it as anger, and to not be apologetic for it, and to then channel it into these productive uses. And, you know, Tracer talks at the very end about how she like, her health was really good when she was writing this book. And that was my experience as well. I mean, that, again, that's why I kept going back to it, especially during this very tough time, and just, you know, rereading it or re-listening to it on my Audible app, because there was something almost therapeutic about, you know, being around people who were not afraid to express their anger, and to realize that there is a sort of we are finally at a place, or perhaps we are again at a place, where women are acknowledging that it's okay to be angry. It's actually correct to be angry. And, you know, we should just embrace that and, you know, take it for the good that it can do, because it actually can do a lot of good, both for ourselves and for our society.
Yeah, I'm going to stop sharing if I can.
Do you want me to make you the host again?
I was looking
And
to close the PowerPoint, but I'm not sure how to do that.
Okay.
Okay, great. So
Okay.
I wanted to kind of stay on this theme of anger, because after the 2016 election, I was really like, it just felt like we were just walking around as zombies for, quite some time. And then after the 2020 election happened, it took a few days for the results to come in, but then I feel, this automatic sense of elation right away. I actually felt angry again, because I realized that the 2016 election was simply lost because Hillary Clinton was a woman, because both Clinton and Biden essentially were very similar on policy points. And Clinton, between the two, would probably have been, was a stronger candidate. And the reason she lost was because she was a woman, and that this like racism that is prevalent in society was also compounded by the sexism that exists. And so another thing that that is really kind of pointed out in the book is that even when women have expressed the anger that they have, even if they've tried to tie it into like patriotic tones, and when the one passage, Rebecca Tracer writes that anger has rarely been acknowledged as righteous and patriotic when it's originated with women, though women have often taken pains to mimic and reference the language and sentiments of America's founding while making their own angry demands for liberty, independence, and equality. And so even though like this anger can have different contours and definitions of it, in essence it's a way that women are being downplayed, that they're put on a different level just as a result of who they are. And when we also look at the intersectionality of race, gender, sexual orientation, disability, and I think that in other issues, I think that the idea of anger and being able to express it and move it into action is really important. And so you mentioned also about the Parkland shooting. How would you compare that to, say, the struggle for Rosa Parks and in the sit-ins for bus boycotts?
Yeah, well, I mean, my feeling is that a lot of this, I mean, I totally agree with you about the anger. I felt the same, you know, in light of the 2020 elections. Although I felt that more during the primary campaigns and the Democratic primary. And I do think that the political candidates face different kinds of challenges. Women political candidates in particular face different kinds of challenges from the activists, which is where I would put the Parkland, you know, the Parkland students and the movements that the movement that they're engaged in. And I just feel like when you're a leader of an activist movement, there's much more room for, and it is actually more effective for many women in particular to speak and work in a group with a sort of collective voice and collective power, which is very difficult, if not impossible, for individual political candidates for an individual political office to do, right? So, and I also think that when you're in a position to engage in collective, in speaking in a sort of collective voice, that also opens you up for engaging in more incremental change and drawing strength from small victories, right? I mean, Rosa Parks, and I think Rebecca Tracer talks about this in Good and Mad, but, you know, of course, Rosa Parks is often depicted in the popular imagination as someone who, you know, was or relatively uninvolved in the civil rights activism before she just got fed up on that bus and engaged in the, you know, in the protests that she's famous for. But of course, that's not true. She was a secretary of the NAACP. She was involved for years and years in that kind of activism, and she was trained and, you know, knew what she was doing when she was on that bus. And so, but I think that that's the kind of thing that is also an opportunity for modern movements like the Parkland survivors and their movement. You know, you can take advantage of the fact that this is a more incremental thing, and you know, you push forward and you make small victories as you go along, and you draw strength from those, and remember that that you have achieved those, and also learn from those victories and from your failures on how to do it better in the future. And you know, you often have not only years but decades in which to continue to push forward and make those score those victories before, you know, you get to the big one. I think that that's just the nature of activism. I mean, in my own life, I've accepted that I'm not going to see all of the changes that I want to see in my lifetime. I'm just happy to be able to contribute what I can contribute to moving the ball forward in the ways that I can most effectively move it forward. And I'm happy and I'm thrilled that I have, you know, sort of partners and collaborators who can work with me to contribute the things that they're good at that I'm not good at. And that we can, you know, we can move our society forward and get to a more equal and more just place. I think that is much harder for political candidates and public officials or elected officials.
Do you think also with changes in demographics that, you know, in terms of having the minorities become the majority by like within the next decades or so, do you think that will change the dynamics of feminism in the sense that will that improve it, or will that really maybe lead to successive waves against feminism?
I have a hard time answering those kinds of predictive questions because I want a certain outcome so much that I can't really give a neutral response. But my feeling is that the women's movement, you know, I think it's clear one of the there are many beauties of Good and Mad, but one of the nice things about the way that it's structured is it shows the sort of progression over time, right? Tracer points out that the first wave of the women's movement had a lot of goals. You know, if we look at their declaration from the declaration that Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote, you know, it is a very ambitious agenda. But really all they managed to accomplish was getting the right to vote. And even that took, you know, 50 years. So when you look at that and you compare it to, you know, the 60s and 70s when the second wave of the women's movement got going, you can see, one, that they got a lot more done in a shorter period of time. And I think that if we look at the events that are happening right now and around us, and we look at the new generations that are coming forward, that they have an opportunity to build on what was done before and to fix some of the problems that we know were problems for the previous waves of the women's movement. So I would fully expect the women's movement, I think it already is, much more diverse, and also much more sort of reflective, and sort of self-conscious about how it needs to move forward. You know, one of the things that I love about Together We Rise, although it comes up in Good and Mad as well, is there really was insufficient attention paid by, you know, the sort of general media, mass media, to the fact that the leaders of that march were largely women of color, and that, you know, that it's actually it's a big question mark whether or not, quite frankly, whether or not a group of white women could have pulled off a march of that size and at that, you know, level of sophistication, because the leaders were not only, you know, they weren't just women of color, they were women of color who had been involved in a bunch of organizing and activism, you know, around issues like police brutality, et cetera. And so, you know, they brought those skills to that movement. And I think that, again, this is also, I hope that this is going to be the case. And so, you know, my prediction is very much influenced by my wishes. But my hope is that the women's movement, the contemporary women's movement, and the people in it understand those kinds of nuances and are reflective about them, and will structure themselves in a way that, you know, surfaces issues of difference and division in a way that can be dealt with productively, and where you can move forward in coalition, even though you know, it's not like the divisions poof go away, but the question is, how do you move forward, and keep those divisions from splintering the movement.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think it's important to think about the solidarity movements that have also grown as a result of the women's movement, and seeing the ways in which they intersect and overlap. And we've had a really invigorating past hour discussion, good and mad. Thank you, Nancy. Do you have any final comments that you wanted to make? Or does anybody else have any other questions?
No, just thank you. It was lovely to be here and have a chance to chat. And you know, and I put my contact information up on the slide, so people should feel free to get in touch.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.